on.
Hi, I'm Will Smith, and this is the last segment of Citizens Forum for July 12, 2016, and I'm going to talk about cannabis. I have had quite a change of consciousness over the past several months in my own life, and I don't know if any of you have ever felt deceived or ripped off in your life, but that's how I feel right now. And so I feel very motivated to talk about this with people who have had a positive experience with cannabis in their life, because most of the information that I hear from our leaders is rather negative. And so our guest today is Deborah Deduck. Did I say it right?
Getting better.
Getting better. And Deborah is here to talk about her experiences over the decades with cannabis and her family. Where are you from originally, Deborah?
I'm originally from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, but actually I grew up on a little farm northeast of Saskatoon on the way to Prince Albert, sort of halfway between. So I'm a girl from the farm originally.
So your family has been farmers for generations, right?
Generations.
And you can trace that back to your history in Eastern Europe, right?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
so it's not something that you just adopted
No.
recently. It's a
No.
So tell us a little bit about your family history with growing hemp.
Well, the best story that I found was about my great aunt, Dolly Kushnerek. And actually, this story is written up in a history book of all the pioneers of the Waka area that I grew up in. And Auntie Dolly, very, very religious woman, every year she would grow her own crop of hemp or cannabis, and she would grow it to collect the seeds. And she would process the seeds, crush them, and then put them in boiling water so that you could draw out the oils. And she would use this oil for cooking purposes during times of Advent and Lent. And I mean, my family was either Ukrainian Greek Orthodox or Ukrainian Catholics, very, very religious. And so there were no meat products eaten, and you were not even allowed to cook with, like a meat fat. So that's why she every year grew the cannabis and processed the seeds, but also from the fiber, she would make cloth, which basically would have been called cheesecloth, which she also would have used in making cottage cheese or basically everyday preparations. But I also read that the fiber from hemp was also used by Ukrainians to make these beautiful waterproof coats. And that goes back to ancient times, that they've been growing hemp and utilizing it since time immemorial, basically. So that was one family story. Another story that my mother told me was about how in the old days, which would be the 20s or the 30s, and all the Ukrainian immigrants were still traveling around and trying to get settled. And you would have all these men that would come and work in the fields. And at the end of the day, you have the big meal. And one of the big meals at the end of, one of the things that they would eat after they had the main dishes and everything, they would cook up the hemp seeds along with some opium, red poppies. My family also grew poppies because they made poppy seed bread, poppy seed cake, and so they would cook the hemp with the poppy seed and put in a little bit of honey, and this would be like a dessert. And my mother said that afterward, they would all be goofy and woozy afterward, but that was what I grew up with, these people that, grew hemp. And when I was talking to my cousin, who's actually 84 years old, And I was telling him the story about Auntie Dolly that was written up in this history book. And he said she grew it until about the late 30s, early 40s, until, you know, the police came into the area. And then one day a police officer knocked on the door and told her she couldn't grow her cannabis anymore because it was illegal. So, you know, and then Ted Smith's partner, Gail Quinn, also told me a story about how the farmers northeast of Edmonton, I think it was the St. Paul area, were growing hemp, cannabis, until the 1950s. And you know, so everybody's still been growing hemp. It just depends which area you were in.
That's what it's really hard for me to believe because I was brought up, I was born during the period of Prohibition. And so I know nothing. I mean, I was born in 1955, so I don't know a time when hemp was just a plant. And the only thing I know is that I've heard stories that people say, you know, that it was just a plant. And as you say, that yes, the psychoactive properties were known, but it wasn't really a big deal. I mean, it wasn't considered to be. In fact, one of the books that we talked about yesterday, there was a reference to someone who referred to it as a spirit. I think they referred to. They used the word spiritual hashish in the same sentence, and I thought that was really interesting because not necessarily that the person was saying that it was spiritual to take hashish, but just that they used, this person who was involved in the temperance movement was using that, which you would think that somebody who is involved in prohibition of alcohol wouldn't mention another intoxicant, but here it was. And I just thought that was a very interesting thing because now in our current society, it just seems that it's so stigmatized that you can't talk about cannabis without people being upset.
Yeah, so. And that's a lot of reason for me coming forward because I have used cannabis since 1972. I was 18 years old. You know, when you talk about the psychoactive properties, I have to wonder, because you want to laugh, because you want to relax and just go to sleep and just be goofy and enjoy the taste of food? You know, is that what they mean by the psychoactive properties? Because when I think about it, if anything is a gateway drug, you know, to worry about, it's alcohol.
Right.
You know, as I told you, I had my first cigarette when I was 6 years old. I mean, and then my first drink at the age of 6. I'm Ukrainian. Everybody made their own alcohol. You know, to me, what I grew up watching, all these farmers, you know, make their own alcohol, grow their own poppies, you know, in the backyard so that the RCMP wouldn't see. And I grew up eating poppy seed cake, poppy seed bread. What's the big deal? Right. And then I walk around town and I see digitalis grows wild everywhere, but everybody calls it fireweed. It looks pretty. But digitalis will kill you. You know, then there's laburnum trees all over, and they've got beautiful flowers like a wisteria, but they're bright yellow. Well, Socrates used that because it's a poison, and that's all allowed to grow freely. And then, to me, what is a wonderful healing herb, when I think about my history with cannabis, even back in the 70s, I used it to get away from alcohol. You know, I used it to relax. I used it back then. I was working in the bank during the day, and at night I worked as a cocktail waitress. That's a hard job. And, you know, like after a night of serving a bunch of drinkers, I really didn't want to drink. So even back then I used cannabis to relax, to just get away and not suffer the effects of alcohol, because boy, have I got stories for you about alcohol.
Well, let's go on to let's
You
talk
know.
about, can you talk to about the healing aspect that you've experienced? Because I think a lot of people are somewhat suspicious of cannabis as a medicine.
Yeah.
We've had a guest who specifically called into question whether or not it really is a medicine. So could you talk
Yeah.
about that, your
Oh,
experience?
yes, I can. But actually, the person you were talking about earlier, talking about eating hashish as a spiritual experience,
Right.
that was Frances G. Willard, and she was the president of the Women's Temperance Union.
Yes, I looked her
And
up.
I found that really interesting that the leader of a temperance union would be more supportive of hashish eating
Yeah,
for the
exactly.
spiritual aspects. But, okay, so, well, I smoked cannabis recreationally until about 83. I quit everything, I raised my children, and in 1996, when I was a single parent, I was diagnosed with stage 3 cervical cancer. I was told by my GP that I was not allowed a second medical opinion because, and I said, why? You know, and he said, well, you're on welfare. You're not allowed to have a second medical opinion. And I just sort of, you know, and it was at that time when all the propaganda was that we citizens were supposedly draining our healthcare system. So they were advising citizens with health issues to take control. So I took control. I asked the doctor when I went to my cancer specialist, and I asked him, I said, how does one get cervical cancer? And long story short, he, after my third question, when he wouldn't give me an answer, because first he attributed it to my level of cleanliness. And I looked at him and I said, my level of cleanliness borders on the obsessive compulsive. The second time I asked, he said it's due to women who live in third world countries and they don't go see their doctors often enough. So I'm starting to get mad, and I'm Ukrainian, and thank goodness my little mother was beside me. And then my third question, he was angry with me, my cancer specialist, because I dared to question his authority. And he said, you're over 40, you've got your children, and you don't need those parts anyway. Now, what they were recommending that they would do to me is they were going to totally remove all of my reproductive system, my lymphatic system, and they were going to do chemo and or radiation on me. And I thought it was one or the other. And the doctor looked at me and he said, we don't know. We'll see what works. And I just thought, well, you know, I couldn't get any help. The father of my children wouldn't take my children. The majority of my family was back in Saskatchewan and having their own things happening. When I went, and like I said, I was on welfare, and I was living in Powell River, and my social service worker basically said to me, oh, that's too bad. But here, you still have to go out and look for work and take this piece of paper around to every employer you go to. And while you're preparing for your death, you know, find a job because you're a drain to the system. So I got a little bit angry. And that's when I started speaking out. But also, I was under a great deal of stress, trying to feed the children, keep a roof over the head, you know. And since nobody would help me, I knew a little bit about what cannabis would do to help me. Basically, I needed to sleep so my body could heal. I'd been into natural healing since about 1976, but I couldn't always afford to go to my natural healers. Uh, you know, so the most cost-effective way for me to deal with my health issues, I bought cannabis every now and then, a little quarter, and I would smoke a little pipeful at night just so I could sleep. And long story short, the doctor basically chased me down. And after a year or two, I finally was given my right to a second medical opinion, because that's when I started getting even more politically involved. And, it's amazing what help you get when you walk into an MLA's office sometimes.
We've only got
Yeah.
1 minute left, but would you like to say anything in particular about someone? I mean, I feel like you've really maybe broken the ice for some people to start their own research. Is there any place you could show us maybe a couple of these books that you have?
The first research I did
quickly, though,
was basically when I moved to Victoria in 2013, I started reading Ted Smith's book.
Okay.
Great way to get information.
And what about this one here?
Dr. McKinney, I met him on the Sensible BC campaign. And when we started talking about cancer and everything, and finding out that he was a naturopathic oncologist, whether he wanted me or not, I'm his patient. And the beauty of working with Dr. McKinney is he was supportive of me using cannabis, and I use it for a lot of different things.
Okay, well,
And-
we got to. I'm sorry,
Sorry.
we have to wind this down. But thank you
Okay.
very much for
Got
coming on.
on a
I know
roll
this
there.
takes
Yeah.
a lot of bravery, I think, to talk about this subject because it's been so stigmatized. So thank you very much for being brave and doing it. Thanks for watching this segment of Citizens Forum, and we'll be back.